In the deep, silent forests of the Pacific Northwest, some legends are true, and some families are tasked with keeping them. Hello, and welcome to Night Drive Stories. My name's Jack, and I drive the silent highways of the Pacific Northwest long after midnight, picking up those who wander these misty roads. Tonight, let me tell you the story I heard from the stranger I picked up just outside the old truck stop at mile marker 99. He was a man who seemed to carry a palpable aura of silence with him, a stillness so profound it felt like a physical presence in the passenger seat. He was of average height and build, but he held himself in a way that seemed unnaturally contained. His movements slow and deliberate, as if he were afraid of making too much noise. His eyes, dark and deep-set, were what truly stood out. They were the eyes of a listener, constantly scanning the world not for things to see, but for sounds to parse and fear. When he spoke, it was in a whisper, a voice so soft and unused it was like the rustle of dry leaves, and I had to turn the radio down completely just to hear him. He gave his name as Ben, and he stared out the window for a long time as if gathering the courage to break a long-held vow. Before he was ready to speak, "Have you ever been truly, deeply afraid of a sound?" Ben began, his voice barely a whisper, a dry, fragile, hesitant thing that seemed to cost him a great deal of effort to produce. It was the voice of a man unaccustomed to using it, as if the very act of speech was a transgression. He was looking at his own reflection in the dark, rain-streaked passenger window. "I don't mean a loud noise that startles you, like a gunshot or a clap of thunder from a summer storm. I mean a sound that is in itself wrong. A sound that breaks the fundamental rules of the world. A sound that proves the universe is not as sane as you thought it was." I told him I had heard many strange and unsettling things on these long, dark roads, but I wasn't sure I understood what he meant by a sound being wrong. He gave a slow, sad nod, as if he expected that answer. As if my ignorance was a kind of innocence he remembered from a long, long time ago. "You will," he said, and it was not a threat, but a statement of quiet, tragic fact. "Because I'm going to tell you one. My story. And once you've heard it, you'll start listening for the wrong sounds too. You'll never be able to trust an echo again." He explained that his entire life, up until the age of 17, had been a strange, quiet, and deeply isolated affair. He didn't have what anyone would consider a normal childhood. His family, his father, a quiet, intense man who worked as a freelance book restorer, his hands always smelling of old paper and glue. His mother, a woman who seemed to be perpetually braced for some unseen tragedy, her smiles rare and fragile. And his younger sister, Sarah, a bright, innocent, chattering spark of light in their otherwise gloomy, silent world, lived a semi-nomadic, almost fugitive life. They moved every few years, always living in remote, rented houses at the edges of small, forgotten towns, never staying long enough to put down roots. He was homeschooled, his lessons consisting of long, silent reading assignments. They had no friends, no relatives who visited. Their family was a closed, hermetically sealed, self-sufficient unit. It all revolved around the pilgrimage, Ben explained, his whisper becoming a low, gravelly murmur. "Everything we did, every decision my father made about where we would live or what work he would take, it was all in service to our annual camping trip. That's what they called it. A pathetic attempt to give it a veneer of normalcy for me and Sarah's sake. But it was no camping trip. It was a ritual, a duty, a terrible, silent, and unavoidable obligation. Every year, in the last week of August, a week his father determined by a complex reading of old hand-drawn star charts, they would pack their old, beat-up station wagon with the barest of essentials, tents, bedrolls, dried food, water, and a heavy, locked, iron-banded wooden box, and they would drive. They would drive for days into the deepest, most remote parts of the Oregon Cascade Range, to a specific unmapped forest that his parents only ever referred to in hushed, reverent, fearful tones as the Whispering Grove. He described that final trip, the one from which he was the sole, silent survivor. He was 17, and filled with the usual teenage cocktail of sullen resentment and restless energy. He hated the trips, hated the oppressive, somber silence that descended on his parents in the weeks leading up to them, a silence that felt heavier and more suffocating than their usual quietude. He hated the bizarre, nonsensical rules they were forced to follow. He just wanted a normal life. He wanted to play football, go to parties, talk to girls on the phone. Instead, he was being dragged once again into the weird, silent heart of his family's strange and private religion. His attempts at normalcy were always quietly, firmly thwarted. A friend who invited him over would be told politely that the family was observing a quiet week. The one time he joined the local library's summer reading club, his family had abruptly moved 2 states away a week later. They weren't just isolated, they were actively curating their own isolation, and he was a prisoner within it. The car was like a funeral procession on wheels, he recounted, his eyes unfocused, watching the memory play out on the dark, rain-swept screen of my windshield. My father drove with a grim, white-knuckled intensity, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the road as if it might betray him at any moment. My mother sat in the passenger seat staring straight ahead, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap they were bloodless. She hadn't said more than 10 words in 2 days. And in the back, there was me, simmering with a silent, impotent resentment, and Sarah, who was only 8, humming a little tune to herself, playing with a small doll, completely, blessedly oblivious to the crushing, terrible weight of the atmosphere in that car. This time something was different. The tension was even higher than usual. His parents seemed more frayed, more frightened. He'd overheard them whispering in the dead of night in the weeks leading up to the trip, using strange, cryptic words he didn't understand, like the echo is growing stronger. And the silence feels thin this year. They had argued, something they never did, about whether Sarah was old enough, whether she could be trusted to be silent. The final leg of the journey was a series of unmarked, unpaved logging roads that grew progressively narrower and more treacherous, the trees crowding in on either side. And then, about a mile from the hidden, unmarked trailhead that marked the entrance to the grove, an ill omen that, in hindsight, sealed their fate. The old, long-suffering station wagon, which had been rattling and groaning for the last hour, gave a final, violent shudder and died. A plume of greasy black smoke billowed from under the hood, a foul-smelling offering to the uncaring sky. His father, a man who could fix anything, tried for half an hour to get it started, his usual calm competence replaced by a frantic, clumsy haste. But it was no use. The engine was completely, irrevocably seized. I remember the look on his face in the fading gray light of dusk. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was pure, abject fear, a violation of the plan, a disruption of the sacred ritual. The pilgrimage was supposed to be a seamless, controlled, perfect insertion into and out of the grove. This was messy, unpredictable, wrong. His father had made the decision. They would proceed on foot. They were too close to turn back now. To miss the appointed time was unthinkable. They would carry what they could and retrieve the rest later. Abandoning the dead car on the side of the forgotten silent road like a metal carcass, they each shouldered a heavy pack. His father took the heavy, locked wooden box, the most important part of their cargo. As the last of the sun's light vanished behind the jagged black peaks of the mountains, they walked in single file down the silent, waiting path, a small, doomed family heading toward their final, terrible communion with a thing that should not be. The normal forest sounds, the crickets and birds, seemed to grow quieter with each step they took, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath, aware of the sacred, terrible place they were about to enter. The entrance to the Whispering Grove was not marked by a sign or a gate, not by any man-made object. It was marked by a subtle, yet profound, and deeply unsettling shift in the very nature of the forest. One moment, they were walking through a normal, if remote, Oregon forest at dusk. The cool mountain air filled with the familiar, comforting sounds of chirping crickets, the rustle of unseen small animals in the underbrush, the distant call of a night bird. The next, they stepped across an invisible, silent threshold, and a deep, oppressive, and utterly unnatural silence fell over them, as if a great, heavy, soundproof blanket had been thrown over the entire world. "It was the first thing you noticed," Ben said, his voice dropping to an even quieter, more cautious whisper, as if he were afraid the grove might still be listening to him across all these years and all these miles. The silence. It wasn't just quiet, the way a forest gets quiet late at night. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, a physical weight that pressed on your ears. All the ambient sounds of the forest, the entire symphony of life, just stopped. Instantly. It was like walking into a soundproofed room in a recording studio. The only sound you could hear was the faint, high-pitched rushing of blood in your own head and the soft, dull crunch of your own footsteps on the pine needles. And even that sounded muted, wrong, as if the ground itself were trying to absorb the sound. He described the uncanny, alien nature of the grove with a chilling, detailed precision that spoke of years of fearful observation. The air, he said, was different. It smelled of nothing at all. Not of pine, not of damp earth, not of decaying leaves. It was a neutral, sterile, almost vacuum-like air that was unnerving to breathe. It felt thin and dead in his lungs. The forest floor was clean, with no deadfall, no rotting logs, no animal tracks or droppings. It was a place devoid of the natural cycle of death and decay, and the flora of the grove, the trees and the plants, was subtly, disturbingly wrong in its perfection. The ancient massive trees, a species of fir he had never been able to identify in any botany book, grew in strangely uniform, almost deliberate patterns, their spacing and height almost mathematically precise. The thick, green velvety moss that carpeted the forest floor grew in perfect, repeating geometric spirals, like millions of tiny green fractals. The fungi that sprouted from the fallen moss-covered logs were a pale, almost phosphorescent ethereal blue, and they didn't grow in random, organic clusters, but in perfect, straight, unwavering lines. It was a forest that seemed to have been designed by a mathematician with a deep and abiding hatred of natural, chaotic growth. And then there was the first rule, Ben continued, his voice a thread of sound in the quiet of my car. The most important, most sacred, most absolute rule of our family. The one that was drilled into me and Sarah from the time we could talk. Never speak above a whisper within the boundaries of the grove, for the trees are always listening, and they learn. My parents were utterly fanatically devoted to this rule. On our pilgrimages, from the moment we crossed the threshold, we communicated only in soft, barely audible whispers, or with a series of complex hand gestures. Laughter was forbidden. Crying was forbidden. Even a cough or a sneeze had to be smothered. It was the central pillar of our entire strange belief system. To illustrate why, to make me understand the visceral, foundational terror behind this rule, he shared a memory that was clearly the foundational trauma of his young life, the moment he first truly, instinctively understood that the grove was not just a strange place, but a place of active, intelligent, and predatory malevolence. It had happened on his very first pilgrimage, when he was 6 years old, and his sister Sarah was just a toddler of 4. Sarah was a happy, boisterous, noisy kid, he recalled, a flicker of warmth and deep sorrow in his voice at the memory of his little sister. The oppressive silence of the grove was hard on her. She wanted to run and shout and sing. My parents were constantly shushing her, their faces tight with a fear I was too young to understand. We were about halfway to the center of the grove when she tripped on a root and fell. It wasn't a bad fall, she just scraped her knee, but she was surprised and frightened. And before my mother could clamp a hand over her mouth, she let out a single, loud, piercing cry of "ow." He said the sound in the dead silence of the grove was shocking, like a pane of glass shattering in a library. It felt like a violation. His parents had frozen, their faces pale masks of pure, abject horror. His father, a man who was never physically demonstrative, had snatched Sarah up with a gasp, while his mother looked wildly around at the silent, watching trees, her hand over her own mouth. For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence just returned, heavier than before, as if the grove was considering what it had just heard. Ben had thought the danger, whatever it was, had passed. And then, it happened. "From deep in the woods to our left," he whispered, his eyes wide and dark in the dashboard light. We heard it. A perfect, flawless echo of Sarah's cry. "Ow!" It wasn't a natural echo, bouncing off a rock face. It was too clear, too perfect in its pitch and timbre, and it came from the wrong direction entirely. Then, a few seconds later, we heard it again, from a different direction, from far behind us this time. and then again, from high up in the canopy of a tree directly above our heads. It was the grove. It had heard her, it had learned her sound, and now it was tasting it, playing with it, using it. Sarah, hearing her own voice calling back to her from the dark woods, started to cry in confusion and fear, and the grove began to mimic her sobs, a chorus of her own perfect stolen sadness echoing around us from all sides, a deeply intelligent and mocking symphony of her terror. My father had grabbed me, my mother clutched Sarah, and we ran, stumbling through the woods, until we reached the place of the ritual. It was the only time I ever saw my father truly, openly terrified. That was the day Ben had learned, in the deepest, most primal part of his soul, the terrible truth of the Whispering Grove. The trees didn't just listen. They learned. They stole sounds. And they used them. The silence of the grove wasn't an absence. It was a presence. It was the canvas upon which the grove painted with the stolen voices of those who were foolish enough to break the first rule. The memory of his sister's stolen sobs echoing through the unnaturally silent woods hung in the car like a cold fog. I could almost hear it myself, the perfect, terrifying mimicry of a child's fear. It was a horror so simple and yet so profoundly wrong it made my skin crawl. Ben's family wasn't just eccentric. They were engaged in a generations-long negotiation with a truly alien form of intelligence. "So you went there every year," Jack interjected, my own voice a low rumble in the quiet space. "To this silent, listening forest. Why? What was the purpose of these pilgrimages? What were you trying to accomplish?" Ben was silent for a long time, as if debating whether to share the final, deepest layer of his family's secret. He watched the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers, each pass seeming to wipe away another layer of his reluctance. "We were the listeners," he finally said, the name spoken with a kind of weary, inherited reverence. "That's what my grandfather called us in the journals I found after it all happened. The journals that finally explained the madness. We were the last of the listeners. It was a bloodline, a duty, stretching back for centuries, maybe longer. The journals were vague on the origin, hinting at ancestors from the old world who had followed the entity here. But our family, for as long as it had been on this continent, was tasked with maintaining a fragile, delicate peace with the ancient, pre-human consciousness that lived in the grove. The pilgrimage wasn't just a tradition, it was a treaty negotiation, and our silence was the terms of the treaty." He explained the true purpose of their ritual. At the precise geometric center of the unnaturally orderly forest was a single, large, flat-topped stone altar, covered in the same spiraling fractal moss as the forest floor. The pilgrimage had one simple, terrifyingly passive goal: to reach that altar on the appointed day, to unpack the contents of the heavy, locked wooden box, and to perform a silent, 4-hour meditation, one member of the family sitting at each of the 4 cardinal points of the stone. "It was a silent offering," he explained, quoting from the journals he now knew by heart. "We weren't sacrificing an animal or giving it gold. We were offering our presence, our quiet, respectful, non-interfering presence. It was a way of showing respect to the ancient intelligence of the grove, a way of acknowledging its sovereignty over that land, without giving it anything new to learn. The silence was the whole point. We were showing it that we understood its nature, and that we would not violate its quiet kingdom with the noise and chaos of our own world." He then tried to explain the nature of the entity itself, the ancient consciousness that his family had spent generations trying to appease. "My ancestor who wrote the first journal called it the Echo," he said, "and it's the best word for it. It's not a physical monster, not a beast with claws and teeth hiding in the woods. As far as I know, it has no physical form at all. It's a vast, silent, patient intelligence that is woven into the very fabric of the grove, the trees, the moss, the soil, and its primary survival mechanism, its way of interacting with the world, is mimicry. Perfect, flawless, instantaneous mimicry of sound. The echo," he explained, "was a sound-based predator. It was a void that sought to understand and assimilate other beings by learning their sounds. When a creature, a bird, a deer, a person, made a sound within the grove, the echo would learn it, absorbing it into its own consciousness. It could then replicate that sound perfectly, at will, from any point within the forest. But it's more than just a recording, Ben said, his voice tense. It's a complete absorption of information. When it learns a sound, it learns everything about the creature that made it. It learns its memories, its emotions, its relationships, its loves, its fears. It learns the very essence of that being, and it uses that knowledge to create a perfect, irresistible, psychologically tailored lure. It will use the sound of a fawn crying to draw the mother deer deeper into the woods. It will use the song of a rare bird to attract a mate. And for people, it uses the sounds of love and concern. And once it has lured you deep enough into the woods, once you are truly lost, it doesn't need to attack you. The grove simply absorbs you. Your consciousness, your memories, your story, you just become another voice in its silent internal choir. You are assimilated. You become a part of its library. The journals described it with chilling metaphors, calling it a library of ghosts and a silent song made of stolen notes. His parents' constant silence, he now realized, was a form of self-erasure, a way of making themselves less interesting, less appetizing to the echo. The heavy, locked wooden box they carried on their pilgrimage contained a set of strange, resonant stones, tuned to a specific frequency that, according to the journals, would deaden the air around the altar, creating a small, temporary bubble of psychic static that made it harder for the echo to listen, a small measure of protection. But the primary defense, the only real defense, was their vow of silence. As long as they remained quiet, they were just shapes, forms, presences. The moment they made a sound, they became a name, a personality, a story. They became food. One journal entry from his great-grandfather was particularly chilling. It does not hunger for our flesh, but for our stories. To be heard by it is to be known by it. To be known by it is to be consumed. He looked at me then, his dark listener's eyes filled with a terrible, tragic understanding. My family had kept the treaty for centuries, he whispered. Hundreds of years of silent, perfect pilgrimages, a long, unbroken chain of quiet respect. But on my last trip, my father, in a single, unthinking moment of pain, broke the chain. He gave the echo a new voice to learn. He gave it an entire person to understand. And in doing so, he gave it the key to unlocking the rest of us. The walk from the dead car to the altar at the center of the grove was a tense, silent, hour-long ordeal. The sun had completely set, and the forest was plunged into a deep, moonless and starless darkness. The only light came from his father's weak, flickering flashlight beam, a tiny, fragile spear of yellow in an ocean of absolute black. Ben described the feeling of being watched, not by a pair of eyes, but by the entire forest, by every silent tree and every patch of glowing blue fungi. He could feel the immense, patient, listening intelligence of the place, and he could feel that it was expectant. The broken-down car was a disruption of the ancient pattern, and he felt that the grove was waiting to see what they would do. They reached the altar, a large, flat, moss-covered slab of dark, volcanic-looking rock in the center of a small, perfectly circular clearing. His father placed the heavy wooden box on the stone and unlocked it with an old iron key. Inside, nestled in black velvet, were the 4 resonating stones, smooth, dark, river-worn rocks covered in faint spiraling glyphs. His father placed one at each of the 4 cardinal points of the altar. His mother lit 4 thick, white, unscented candles. This was the extent of their ritual paraphernalia. Simple, quiet objects. We took our places, Ben recounted, his own body tensing in my passenger seat as he relived the memory. My father at the north, my mother at the south, me at the east, and little Sarah at the west. We sat cross-legged on the damp, cold moss, our backs to each other, facing out into the dark, silent forest. The ritual was simple. 4 hours of silent, unbroken meditation. We were to empty our minds, to offer the grove our quiet, empty presence, until the specific constellation my father had shown me in his charts reached its zenith directly overhead. That would mark the end of our duty for another year. The physical and mental strain of the ritual was immense. maintaining absolute silence and stillness for hours, while surrounded by that oppressive listening presence, was a form of torture. Ben felt like a specimen under a microscope, his every thought, his every heartbeat, being observed and catalogued by the vast, silent intelligence that surrounded them. They settled into the silence. Ben tried to meditate, to clear his mind as his father had taught him, but he couldn't. His 17-year-old mind was a riot of resentment and fear. He was angry at his father for this strange, meaningless life. He was terrified of the listening darkness that surrounded him. He kept thinking about his sister's stolen sobs from years ago, and he imagined them still echoing silently through the ancient trees. An hour passed. Then, too. The only sound was the frantic, silent beating of his own heart. And then, the weather turned. The air, which had been still and stagnant, began to stir. A low, moaning wind began to move through the high canopy of the trees. The temperature dropped, and then the rain began. A few fat, cold drops at first, and then a sudden, violent, torrential downpour. It wasn't a normal storm, Ben said, his voice a low, intense whisper. It was as if the sky itself was breaking open. The rain was coming down so hard it was deafening, a constant roaring white noise. And the wind. It was a gale, howling through the trees, a sound full of rage. In seconds we were soaked to the bone, our candles instantly extinguished. The flashlight flickered and died. We were plunged into a chaos of absolute darkness and overwhelming violent sound. The storm turned the grove, a place defined by its silence, into a maelstrom of noise. The wind shrieked. The rain hammered the ground. Branches cracked and fell. It was disorienting, terrifying. Ben could barely see his own hands in front of his face. He could feel his sister, Sarah, trembling with cold and fear beside him. He could hear his mother's sharp, frightened intake of breath. The perfect, controlled silence of their ritual was shattered by the chaos of the storm. And then it happened. The single fatal mistake. The sound that unmade his world. "My father," Ben whispered, his voice cracking with a grief that was still raw after all these years. He stood up, trying to get his bearings in the dark, to gather us together, to make sure Sarah was all right. The altar stone was slick with rain. He lost his footing. He fell, hard. His leg twisted under him at a sickening angle, and I heard a sickening, wet, snapping sound over the roar of the wind, the sound of a large bone breaking. And in the brief, momentary lull between two great gusts of wind, his father, a man who had dedicated his entire life to the vow of silence, a man in absolute blinding agony, did the one thing he was never, ever supposed to do. He cried out in pain. It wasn't a loud sound, just a sharp, clear, unwilled, purely reflexive cry of agony. A sound of pure, helpless human suffering. The sound was immediately swallowed by the roar of the storm. For a moment, Ben hoped, prayed, that the chaos of the wind and rain had masked it, that the grove hadn't heard it. But his hope was a fragile, stupid thing. The grove heard everything. A moment later, a perfect, loving, flawless mimic of his father's voice, a voice not of pain, but of pure, gentle reassurance, began calling to his mother from deep within the dark, rain-swept trees to their right. It was not just his father's voice, it was his father's personality. It was the voice he used when his wife was worried, a voice full of calm strength and gentle love. "Mary? Mary, I'm all right," the voice called. And it was his father's voice down to the last nuance, the last subtle tremor. "Don't worry. I found a dry place, an overhang in the rocks. It's sheltered here. Come on, bring the children. It's safe over here." Ben's mother, panicked and disoriented, her love for her husband overriding her generations of ingrained training, turned toward the sound of her husband's voice. Ben, in the flashing, strobing light of a distant lightning strike, saw the look on her face. It was one of pure, unthinking relief. She was about to answer him, to call out his name. Ben acted on pure instinct. He reached out and grabbed her arm, shaking his head frantically, his eyes wide, trying to communicate the terrible truth with a single, silent gesture. This is not him. It's a trap. It's the echo. But it was too late. The hook had been expertly, cruelly set. The moment the perfect, loving mimicry of his father's voice echoed through the storm-tossed darkness, the nature of the night changed. It was no longer a struggle against the elements, a test of endurance. It was a hunt, and his family, isolated and terrified, were no longer a unified whole. They were now individual, vulnerable targets. The echo, the silent, patient intelligence of the grove, had been given a new instrument to play, and it began its terrible psychological assault with a terrifying surgical precision that spoke of ancient, practiced cruelty. My mother was lost in that first moment, Ben recounted, his voice thick with the memory of his own helpless, silent, screaming panic. All she heard was her husband, the man she loved, alone and hurt in the dark and the storm, telling her he was safe, telling her to come to him. All her years of training, all the warnings, all the inherited fear. It was all washed away by the simple, powerful, irresistible human need to go to him, to be with him. Ben clung to her arm, trying to hold her back, shaking his head, his eyes wide with a silent, frantic plea. He tried to communicate the terrible truth through his grip alone. It's not him. It's a lure. Stay here. But in the chaos of the storm, in her own panic, she couldn't understand his warning. She saw his desperate grip not as a plea to stay, but as a frightened child's attempt to hold on to his mother in the storm. He watched her pry his fingers from her arm, her expression a mask of maternal concern. "It's all right, Ben," he remembered her whispering to him, her voice a comforting, tragic lie that would echo in his nightmares forever. "Your father found us a place to shelter. We have to go to him." She gently but firmly pushed him back towards Sarah. She gave him a last reassuring look, a look of a mother who was certain she was doing the right thing, and then she turned and walked into the absolute darkness, toward the sound of her husband's calm, reassuring voice. Ben watched her go, the weak beam of his dying flashlight cutting a weak, trembling path, until her form was swallowed by the driving rain and the oppressive black woods. He was frozen in place by a horror so profound, it was paralyzing. He was a 17-year-old boy, and he had just watched his mother walk willingly, lovingly, into a trap set by a monstrous, sound-mimicking ancient forest. His was the ultimate horror of a silent witness, unable to scream a warning, trapped by the very rule that was supposed to protect them. He was left with his father, who was still on the ground, clutching his broken leg, his face pale and contorted in agony, and his little sister Sarah, who was sobbing with cold and fear. The grove, now having learned his mother's voice as she whispered her last comforting words to him, was armed with a new weapon. A moment after his mother had vanished, a new voice called out, this time from the direction she had gone. It was his mother's voice, a perfect, flawless echo. But her voice was no longer calm. It was filled with a rising, worried panic. "David, David, I can't see you. The light went out. Where are you? I'm lost." The effect on his father was instantaneous. The searing pain from his broken leg was forgotten. All he heard was his wife, lost and frightened in the dark, calling for him. He tried to push himself up, his face a mask of agony and desperate concern. "Mary," he whispered, his voice a ragged, broken sound. He had forgotten the first rule again in his panic. "No," Ben whispered frantically, grabbing his father's shoulder, trying to hold him down. "Dad, no, it's not her, it's the grove, it's a trick." But it was no use. The echo was a master psychologist. It now had both their voices, and it began to weave them together in a terrible, heartbreaking duet. His mother's frightened calls, his father's reassuring answers. A phantom conversation between two people who were both being lured deeper and deeper into the woods. Their love for each other being used as the very chain that was dragging them to their doom. His father, driven by the primal protective need to find his wife, to save her, pushed Ben aside and began to drag himself, his broken leg trailing uselessly behind him, into the darkness, toward the sound of her desperate, stolen voice. Ben was left alone on the altar with his little sister Sarah, who was now weeping uncontrollably, her small body racked with sobs. He clutched her to him, trying to smother her sounds with his own body, whispering, "Shh, Sarah, please, you have to be quiet, you have to be quiet," his own voice a desperate, terrified prayer. And then came the final, most monstrous and most brilliant lure of all. The grove, now knowing the voices of his entire family except for his own, fell silent for a long, terrible moment. The only sound was the howling of the wind and the rain and Sarah's terrified sobs. And then, a new sound emerged from the darkness, from a place that sounded disturbingly, impossibly close, just a few yards away in the impenetrable black. It was a beautiful, harmonious chorus of both his parents' voices. They were no longer afraid or in pain. They were laughing. A warm, happy, loving sound. "It's all right, sweetie," his mother's stolen voice called, full of warmth and joy. The voice was perfect. It even carried the specific lilt of loving reassurance she only used with Sarah. "We found the car. Your father got the engine started. It's warm in here." Then his father's voice joined in, strong and cheerful. "Come on, Sarah Bear. Your mother's right. Time to go home. We'll get you some hot chocolate on the way, your favorite kind with the little marshmallows." It was a perfect, beautiful, irresistible, and utterly evil lie. For a terrified, freezing 8-year-old girl lost in the dark, the sound of her parents, safe and happy, offering the promise of warmth and home and her favorite treat, was more powerful than any fear. Sarah's sobs stopped instantly. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with a desperate, shining hope. "Mommy, Daddy," she whispered. She tore herself from Ben's grasp before he could react and scrambled off the altar, running into the absolute darkness toward the sound of her parents' happy, loving, monstrous laughter. Ben was left completely alone on the cold stone, frozen in silent, screaming terror, having just watched as each of his family members was lovingly, surgically, and irresistibly dismantled by the perfect, beautiful, stolen echoes of their own love. Ben was left completely alone in the raging, chaotic heart of the Whispering Grove. The storm still howled, the rain still hammered down, but the world had contracted to the small, cold, moss-covered space of the stone altar. He was huddled on it, shivering, his arms wrapped around his knees, the sole survivor of a massacre that had been conducted not with claws or teeth, but with perfect, loving, stolen words. He was 17 years old, and he had just watched his entire world, his entire reason for being, be consumed by a sound. The one thing that kept him sane, the one thread he clung to in the swirling madness of that night, was the first rule: silence. His father, his mother, his sister, they had all been taken because they had made a sound, because they had given the echo a weapon to use against them. He had remained a whisperer, a creature of hand gestures and quiet breaths. And so he was, for the moment, invisible to the grove, a shape without a name, a presence without a voice. His silence was his only shield. He bit down on his own lip, tasting the coppery tang of blood, to keep his own sobs, his own grief, from escaping and becoming another tool for the monster that surrounded him. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, a lifetime of terror passing in the dark. And then, the grove, knowing that there was still one more soul left in its domain, tried one last time. It had no sound for him, no voice of his own to use as a lure. So it used the voices of those he loved in a final, terrible, beautiful and monstrous assault, a symphony of love designed to break him. The voices emanated from the darkness just beyond the clearing, a carefully orchestrated, psychologically perfect composition. He heard his mother's voice, warm and gentle, singing the specific off-key lullaby she used to sing to him when he was a child and afraid of the dark. He heard his father's voice, full of a proud, booming warmth he hadn't heard in years, calling his name, telling him he'd found a clear, easy path back to the road, and that he was so proud of him for being so brave and quiet. And he heard Sarah's voice, her happy, childish laughter, the most painful, soul-tearing sound of all, calling, "Benny, come play. We're all together now. We made a fire. We're waiting for you." The voices all blended together, a beautiful, harmonious chorus, a perfect, impossible illusion of his family, whole and happy and safe, waiting for him just a few steps away in the darkness. The temptation was almost unbearable. He could almost smell the wood smoke from their fire, almost feel the warmth. His grief-stricken, terrified, 17-year-old mind wanted so badly to believe it, to just give in, to stand up and walk into the dark toward the sound of his family's love. It was the promise of an end to the fear, an end to the loneliness. It was the promise of reunion. It was the ultimate test of his adherence to the rule, a final, seductive invitation. But he resisted. He squeezed his eyes shut, clamped his hands over his ears, and focused on the one, cold, hard, terrible truth. They were gone. This was not them. This was the echo. This was the monster, wearing the voices of his family like comfortable, well-worn clothes, singing a beautiful, deadly siren song. He stayed on the altar, silent and motionless, a stone of grief in a sea of beautiful, terrible lies. Eventually, after what seemed like hours of this beautiful, terrible concert, the forest seemed to understand that this last lure was not working, and the voices all at once just stopped. The storm began to die down. The rain softened to a drizzle, then to nothing. And the silence, the deep, profound, hungry silence of the grove, returned, heavier and more absolute than ever before. It was the satisfied, sated silence of a predator that has just finished a large, satisfying meal. Ben had stayed on that altar until the first, gray, watery light of dawn filtered through the impossibly perfect trees. He had then, on numb, trembling legs, walked out of the whispering grove, back through the silent, geometrically perfect forest, not daring to look back, his own soft footsteps sounding like thunder in the quiet. He had walked for 2 days, following the logging roads, surviving on a single energy bar he had in his pocket, before he finally stumbled into a small, sleepy town and was found by a sheriff's deputy. He was a mute, traumatized, half-starved boy who couldn't or wouldn't explain what had happened to his family. "I'm the only one who knows the truth," he finished, his long, whispered story finally at an end. He was looking at me now, his dark listener's eyes filled with a terrible, lonely burden. They conducted a search, of course, for weeks, a huge operation. They found the abandoned car. They found our soggy, deserted camp by the altar stone. They found no tracks, no signs of a struggle, no bodies. My family, they just vanished from the face of the earth. I was the sole suspect for a while, the disturbed teenage son, but they had no evidence, no motive. Eventually, they just called it one of those tragic, unsolved wilderness disappearances, the kind that happens all the time out here. He explained that he has lived his life as a near mute ever since, a drifter, a ghost. He was terrified that if he spoke too loudly, if he let his voice carry on the wind, the echo might hear him again across all the miles, that it might have saved a seed of his whisper from all those years ago, waiting for it to grow. "But I think I know why it let me go," he said, his final words a chilling, cosmic possibility, the purpose behind his own narration. "My grandfather's journals talked about it. The grove is a closed, isolated system. But it's curious. Sometimes it lets one escape. One who knows the story, one who carries the silence within them. It lets them go to carry the seed of the grove's silence and its story out into the wider world. A warning, maybe," he added, his dark eyes locking with mine, making me a part of his story now. Or a way to plant new gardens. He had no more to say. I drove him to a small, sleeping town just over the state line and let him out at a bus station that was just opening for the day. He gave me a single, grateful, silent nod and disappeared into the pre-dawn gloom, a man forever trapped in a vow of silence. As I drove away, the first birds of the morning began to sing their chaotic, beautiful, natural songs. But I found myself listening not to their notes, but to the silence in between. I thought about the power of a voice, the power of a story, and I wondered if Ben had just unburdened himself, or if he had just passed the seed of that terrible, listening silence on to me. And now, to you. Listen closely. Can you hear it?